I'll ask Sharon. Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to our keynote session. This is the second session of the day for the 6th International Workshop on Financial System Architecture and Stability. I'm actually joining from home, but very close to University of Victoria. So to begin, I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Sanish people whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. So my name is Basma Majerbi. I'm a finance professor at Gustafsson School of Business at University of Victoria. I am also the co-chair of the conference, along with Reem, Michael, and Christy. And I'm absolutely thrilled and I'm honored to introduce today our keynote speaker, Professor Andrew Karolyi. I think many of you here know Andrew, not only through his wide and extensive research contributions to the field of finance, but also through his high level of engagement. You know, he's been a regular to all the top finance conferences, like also was the president of WFA and on the board of AFA and FMA and many others. But let me just give a little bit of background for the purpose of those of you who are joining for the first time. Andrew Karolyi is a professor of finance, and he's the holder of the Harold Bierman Jr. Distinguished Professorship in Management at Cornell University. I think he's joining from a nice studio today. He will talk about it. And before that, he's also the dean of the S.C. Johnson College of Business. And before that, he taught for like close to 2 decades, Andrew, I guess, at the University of Ohio State University. And at that time, I was just talking to Andrew before we start the session. We had the pleasure of hosting him here at the University of Victoria for a Lansdowne public lecture, which was a fantastic one, talking about competitiveness of the US financial capital markets. So Andrew is a prolific researcher in the field of investment management with a focus on international financial markets. He published extensively in all the top finance journals and also produced several books and monographs. He also had several awards for his work that I will not mention. They are on the website. But one of the, I don't know if Andrew sees that as the highlight or not, but relevant to our talk, he was the editor and executive editor of the Review of Financial Studies, one of the top tier finance journals, where he you know, produced a very special issue on climate finance. And he's also Canadian, for those of you who don't know, graduated from McGill, so basically we share the same school, and also worked for Bank of Canada before continuing with his PhD and MBA at University of Chicago. So before I pass it on to Andrew, I would like to remind everyone that you can put questions on the chat while we go, but Andrew will answer those questions at the end of the session. So Andrew, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Basma, for that very generous introduction. What a privilege, actually, to be the keynote speaker for the 6th workshop, the International Workshop on Financial System Architecture and Stability. The forum is doing really important work, and I am bringing researchers, practitioners, policymakers together each year to talk about these big challenges related to financial stability, sustainability, shared prosperity. I'm really grateful to you, Basma and Michael, for honoring me with this invitation. And I want to start by just extending my congratulations to you, UBC's Christy Stevenson, City University's Reem Ayadi, for the important work. I'm really energized and jazzed up by the theme this year, post-COVID and the race to net zero. Because honestly, it focuses our collective attention on what I think is the mission critical role of financial markets, institutions in helping to address the challenges of the public and private sector financing of investments towards mitigation and adaptation to climate change. It may be the most acute global problem that we face as a society. Now, judging by the program and the incredible array of speakers, discussants, tomorrow's clean tech panelists, you're taking on the big issues: stock returns, ESG ratings, stock returns or bank distress, carbon risk management and CDSs, extreme weather events, sovereign debt. Those are just some of the things that I saw in the program, and the excellent first session today that we all just watched. I can clearly see that everybody here on this call is similarly energized like I am about the topic before us. Now, Basma, Michael, and I talked a month or so ago about what would be a useful talk here, and we agreed that I would share the story of how I personally became involved in moving climate finance research forward, and now I'm involved in policy advocacy. It might be interesting to some of you. Some of you may have heard elements of the story before in my role at the RFS. I want to assure you all that it's a positive story about the building of what I'd like to call, maybe boldly, the first body of knowledge on climate finance. This was, as Basma mentioned, when I was at executive editor of the RFS. Like I said, I believe it affirms why we're all gathered. But the behind the scenes aspect of the story, I think, brings out some important dimensions that, honestly, if I'm standing here today looking back, I did not fully appreciate at the time. And now I'm coming to appreciate in retrospect, given what I think the venture's success has bestowed. Now, little did I realize at the time, this concept of what I call an important concept called knowledge co-creation, the event, which is the theme that I really want to emphasize today. I'm going to actually conclude with a challenge for each of you. So I guess I'm asking you to buckle up and get ready for the last 20 minutes of our hour. I hope that through the talk up to that point, I draw out a lot of good Q&A and discussion, and that we all leave the hour feeling energized in turn. Wicked knowledge co-creation, an imperative for climate finance. So let's start with some definitions, basically, so we're all on the same page here. What in the world are you talking about, Andrew, in knowledge co-creation? So here's a formal definition. This comes from an article this is an ecological economics article by Herman Pilat. It's called Creative Human Activity Embedded in and Influenced by Evolutionary Processes in Many Dimensions across varying scales and over different time dimensions. Now, I read that, and that's a formal definition. It sure looks like it, and it is so totally abstract to become almost totally useless. Like I said, it comes from ecological economics and the subdiscipline in ecological economics called social learning. What I think it is trying to hint at is that there are complex interactions between knowledge and decision making that links many aspects: social, cultural, political influences, economic players, and involves people like researchers, households, corporations, governments, policymakers. And so it's kind of too sterile for my liking. So maybe a better way is when you bring a policy-linked angle into it. This is out of an article by Forberg et al., basically back as far as 2015. So it says here, knowledge co-creation is something of long-lasting outcomes that aim to address societal needs by fundamentally changing relationships, positions, and rules involving stakeholders through an open process of participation, exchange, and collaborations with the relevant stakeholders. So now, of course, I added the adjective wicked here to this policy-oriented idea of a research collaboration to emphasize what we're all talking about. As I mentioned before, one of the world's most acute societal needs. The example being of addressing the challenges of climate change. So that's the wicked part of knowledge co-creation. But you can see, I think, the important elements of a multi-stakeholder, foundational architecture of knowledge co-creation is a multi-stakeholder dimension to this. And that's really what we're talking about. So I don't know if you recognize who this person is before you here. The architect of this knowledge co-creation, this ecological economics line of reasoning on social learning, it all points to the seminal work of Nobel laureate Lynn Ostrom, 1996, what she called co-production. Yep, that's the Ostrom, 2009 Nobel laureate in economics, the first woman to win the prize. And to this day, only one of two women of nearly 100 awardees, please take note, who won for her work in showing, I'm sure you all know the work, about the importance of cooperation and mutual monitoring of agreed upon rules among competing individuals, as it is the way of solving ourselves out of the problem of the tragedy of the commons. Now, the place where you should go if you're really interested in her writing on this topic of knowledge co-creation as it links to co-production is this World Development article, and it relates to side issues for us. She uses this as a paper for delineating co-production issues related to economic development, and specifically talks about a couple of clinical studies of how officials in, for example, Brazil were working with and engaged with citizens to develop urban infrastructure. And then I think another case study in terms of Africa with respect to enhanced schooling. Look, I don't think I have to convince anybody in this audience that climate finance solutions may be the, shall we say, wickedest of wicked problems. You would honestly have to be lying under the rock, under a large rock, to have missed the wave of news about the IPCC 6th Comprehensive Assessment Report that dropped a couple of weeks ago. As you all know, it involves what, hundreds of authors, 3,000 pages, and is representing the scientific consensus that affirms much of what we already knew about the state of the globe's climate. I think what, if anything it does in 2021, is it removes some elements of uncertainty that may have wrongly served to reassure some powerful economic and political interests and the wider public that things may not be as bad as we think. So while this one, by the way, this report focuses on the physical science basis for climate change, the more relevant one for us is the one that's going to drop next February 22, which is all about climate mitigation and the assessed economic costs and policy measures. Now, I also don't have to tell you that policymakers and regulators are not waiting for next February 2022 to start thinking about things and acting on them. You see the picture on the left there of Gary Gensler, the current chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Commissioner Allison Herron-Lee on the right. I've drawn some logos here from the Financial Stability Board's task force for climate-related disclosures, the G20's Sustainable Finance Working Group, the IFRS, IOSCO. Nobody's waiting for next February as they proceed with what I know many of you are aware of, which are the mandatory climate change-related risk disclosures that are being really foisted upon us by investor demand. Look at the session this morning about ESG ratings and this sort of the scattershot and challenges. I love the back and forth of the discussants this morning and the presenters about some of these ratings and the challenges therein. This is all the same stuff that we're talking about here as policymakers are now moving forward. So let me move forward to talk a little bit about the unexpected call I received in April 2015. I had just I was the editor for already 4 years, and I became the executive editor at the IWFS. I can safely say now, 2021, that call that I got in May, actually it was in April of 2015, has launched what I think is a wicked knowledge co-creation event, literally before I even knew what the heck that was. It's a little over six years ago, and there was this unexpected call. Can everybody see the screen? This is the email literally I received that I remember taking to my wife that evening and saying, is this a crank email or is this real? It came from the desk of the Accounting for Sustainability and the Center for Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, two of the charities of the Prince of Wales, His Royal Highness. And you can see it was an invitation to come to London on the 27th of May at some undisclosed location where we would gather together with senior staff of the two charities and their management teams, as well as with His Royal Highness. And being the good Canadian, born and raised that I am, I figured this was and my wife and I, of course, together, decided that this was an event that we couldn't pass up. I shouldn't pass up even the giant secrecy that surrounded it and the mystery of it. But here are the words that really caught my attention. It says, in light of the significant role of the review of financial studies plays in finance and education, leading research across all the major fields of financial research and being one of the most widely respected and cited academic journals on finance, and one of the most, and so on, widely cited journals in economics, we would value your contributions to the discussion. Now, it wasn't until I got there that I fully realized what their logic and reasoning was towards inviting a journal editor to London to discuss and brainstorm dealing with what they called finance for the future, thinking about the 21st century challenge. But it was essentially the fact that they, as conveners of chief financial officers from around the world and chief investment officers from around the world, they had basically been interacting, and what they had come to realize, and what we now know in retrospect at the time, 2016, is that the issues before corporations and large asset owners and asset managers with respect to how to mobilize capital towards fostering investment in mitigation and adaptation to climate change, the financial science underlying the rationale for it did not exist. They knew that. They had done their homework before they called on me and other journal editors to show up. And it was reaffirmed to us when we got there. And my favorite part of the story was during the day, of course, it was very, very enjoyable to interact with all the individuals, including His Royal Highness. But it was very, very clear that the whole point of the exercise was to put those of us who they were perceived to be the gatekeepers of knowledge in the discipline of finance to exhort us to take some action. So this is an example of what they actually did. So this is a Web of Science dump from the top 3 journals in finance I did it as of 2018. Obviously, it's no different if you did it as of 2016, where we searched for the words climate change in any articles published in any journal, any of the top 3 finance journals. And what you would come back with is a complete null set. There was literally, and they knew this, perhaps I didn't fully realize it, and my colleagues hadn't fully realized it, but literally there was no research in the top journals. Now, in case you're wondering whether this is a silly exercise, just substitute the top 5 econ journals, and you would see that the economics discipline more broadly than just the finance discipline was at that time much more aware of the challenges and the issues before them. But for CFOs and CIOs, it was made clear to me is that general economics questions are not the ones that are the most salient for their decision-making with respect to investing in managing and anticipating challenges of climate change. And here are some of the articles. So then I was sent home after a very enriching meeting there, and I kept sitting there and thinking, so I think the challenge here is that we need to do something. Should we do something? And to do something, we need to understand what may be the problem. And what may be the problem is that maybe, just maybe, lots of researchers, young researchers, more seasoned researchers, just perceive the risks of taking on a research project that focuses on these big issues are too great, too great. If you believe that the issues matter for the markets, and that was clearly made clear to me, if I didn't understand it already. And furthermore, that the research in the discipline of finance was lagging. That's pretty clear to me if you believe the previous slide that I showed you. What must it be that was precluding us from engaging in this? Was it because we didn't have adequate data? Perhaps it was too costly for us to invest in proprietary data acquisition. Maybe the scholars are feeling like the deans and dean types weren't provisioning in their research budgets to help build these kinds of databases to take on these big problems. Maybe there was uncertainty as to whether or not the journal editors and or the referees of journals had an appetite for this topic. You know, there's a whole bunch of these things. And so my logical reasoning and that of the team that I drew in at the RFS to think about this, what we did was try to brainstorm how to shift the risks away from what we thought might be eager scholars out there in the discipline who wanted to take on these issues, but kind of needed a pathway to find a way to get this. Now, of course, the condition had to be RFS, top elite selective journals. It had to be a very rigorous scientific review process all along the same lines. And how do you create papers that don't exist, right? How do you create them? You can't have a call for papers. I suppose you could have, but that you really only do if there are completed working papers, and we really didn't see any out there at that time, 2016, 2017. So how do we create incentives for people to engage in the research, knowing that they hadn't been at that point, let alone, you know, written and completed things? So I'm also involved separately at the same time with this thing called the Open Science Movement. And the Center for Open Science, you can see the logo there. This movement is all about creating a platform for open research in all disciplines, not just business and management. And there was this clever and innovative idea called a registered report that was invented by this gentleman, Chris Chambers, in the UK. He edited this journal in psychology called Cortex. And he invented the concept there in 2014. And the idea is very simple. By the way, if you don't take notes on any of this, I'm more than happy to share the slides with Basma afterwards so she can post them. But the idea is very simple. In order to foster greater transparency, the idea would be that editors would accept not completed papers, but rather proposals for papers where the review process would take place on the proposal before the results are known. And this is an idea by which we can try to get ahead of the outcomes and to ameliorate what people call the publication bias and facilitate publication of, for example, negative and non-results, if that's in fact what the science dictates. So it's an honorable movement. I actually took this idea and conflated it with the problem we were trying to address with the inconvenient void of no research on climate finance. And I figured this, maybe just this, would be a disciplined editorial review process by which we could set out before the scholars so they could trust it, that it's rigorous, and yet be able to encourage those people sitting on the fence wondering or not whether or not to take on a research paper related to climate finance, an important topic that we had all agreed. And it just basically is like this. Instead of the usual process where you develop an idea, design a study, collect and analyze data, and write the paper, and then submit it to a journal, at that point with peer review, that's the way we usually do things in finance, right? You shift the review process 2 stages or earlier. And you basically have the peer review process of the design of the study, the integrity of the design of the study, knowing the data that you would collect and analyze, and then write up thereafter, again, to ameliorate the publication bias. So how do you actually do this? So this is me again now in the aftermath You could say a light bulb went off, I guess, but there were a whole heck of a lot of steps that come next, right? So I call this the RFS Climate Finance Initiative in 5 quote unquote easy steps. So the first thing I had to do was convince the board of the Society for Financial Studies, of the importance of the topic and the possibility of this alternative editorial process. And I'm going to give them a lot of credit at the time. The leadership at the time actually saw the possibilities right away. And they saw what we were trying to do in terms of shifting the risk burden among young scholars who were eager to take it on. We had to recognize what we didn't know. And so I grabbed 2 buddies, Harrison Hong on the left and Jose Schenkman on the right, 2 collaborators, friends from years before, who I had known that were doing research on climate economics before this. And they joined forces with me as guest editors. The next thing, and I didn't think of this as a knowledge co-creation event, but we wanted stakeholders, right? Multiple stakeholders. Well, the inspiration was A4S and CISL, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. So I brought them into the formulation of the idea, but we also knew we needed a forcing function in terms of a sponsor, and that's Norgesbank. And so they jumped in. We also then built a blue ribbon scientific committee to make sure that the process was rigorous. We designed the editorial protocol that I'll show you a slide on in a second. And then once you build it, like the field of dreams, you've got to make sure and hope, I guess just hope, that people actually respond and show up and actually participate and engage in the process. Because without the scholars, the first 5 steps were pretty much a waste of time. So here was the editorial protocol. So we would have a call for proposals in January of 17. We had a deadline. It was tight. There was a first pass with the editors, a second pass with the program committee with some anonymous reviewer reports. We called that the first round. Then we invited a number of those proposals to come to a workshop, kind of like this, in November of 17. That was at New York City at Columbia University in their faculty club. It was actually very well attended. I think it was like 110 people that were actually physically there. And thereafter, the editors hunkered down and basically extended offers to the teams of researchers of what we call in-principle acceptance, which is, we will publish your paper. If you execute it as you say you will, we will have some guardrails to make sure that you're doing what you said you were going to do. If you deviate from the plan, just make sure that you're fully transparent about the deviation and why and how. And so those were extended in January of 2018. We knew that there were papers on the sidelines that were going to come forward as a result of the call, because we knew that there were people that were seeing the opportunity from a top journal creating space, and that other working papers would come along. So we created a secondary call for what we called newly completed working papers to join us for what will be a second conference of the completed studies. We also, of course, had a second round of anonymous reports. The second conference was in London. That was a great, you could see why that was a good location given the Prince of Wales Charities, as well as a big London office for Norgesbank. That's the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the multi-trillion-dollar monster. And then we had one more third round of anonymous reviewer reports after that final set of presentations at the conference in London. And it led to this March of 2020 issue that dropped. What is that now? A year and a half ago. So there's the protocol that was laid out. Very rigid, structured, with finite time limits and so on. Who answered the call? We had 106 proposals, and they came from all over the world. I'm really proud of this. You know, the fact that only 46% came from the US reminds us, like what you're doing here today and tomorrow, is that the appetite for research on these really big societal problems are truly global in scope. And you can see here are the places from which proposals came forward. Another incredibly gratifying aspect of this exercise was that almost, 63% of the proposals were authored or co-authored by assistant professors and PhD students, which tells you that, in fact, those that were sitting on the margin hoping and dreaming to participate in research on this really important question of climate finance were disproportionately younger people that just needed some kind of path. It was affirming of our idea that shifting the risk burden might have been the trick to get things over the hump. And I'm sure many of you have seen this first body of knowledge, the 9 papers plus an editorial in the March issue. 2 of them are on sea level rise. 3 of them focus on investor attitudes to climate change. These papers are now getting very nicely cited. There's a theory model on modeling pricing uncertainty related to climate change, 1 on hedging climate change news, 2 corporate studies on financial policy, kind of have elements of what we were seeing in the first session today, actually, and some other ones that are coming on. And of course, you're all citing these papers because you know them. My editorial with Jose and Harrison leads the issue, and then there's a series of these papers. So I'm really proud of this. I'm sure you can imagine. Has there been any impact? Well, I actually checked on this last weekend. The 10 articles, including the editorial, have actually accumulated 9.5 citations. You know, I don't know if this is an ultimate measure of what is impact, but 9.5 citations per article is actually more than double that of the 375 articles published in 2020 in the top 3 journals, more than double. So it feels like the world has been waiting for this research to come forward. I'm proud to say that the Barnett, Brock, and Lars Hansen paper, the theory paper, has been recognized as the best paper published in the RFS in 2020. That came down at the Cavalcade meetings in May. And guess what? Look at FMA, American Finance Association, WFA, EFA just last week, NFA. The FMA has had not just 1, not just 2, not just 3, but 4 separate sessions on climate finance. They're popping up all over the place now. People understand, and look at our whole 2 days here is devoted to the questions related. I just checked on SSRN and looked up climate finance, and there were 900 working papers listed. So there's so much more to come on this topic. And now, just in case you think, oh, Andrew, balloons and streamers and cheering and, you know, mission accomplished, I understand it is far, far from the case. Let's not pop the champagne and declare victory. It's worthwhile to pause and reflect on what really might constitute success. And it is true that I and my collaborators, we really had no clue what knowledge co-creation was before we embarked on this giant enterprise, but we understood the importance of being responsive to the call for the research, remember, from the CFOs and CIOs, and to involve others. And so, you know, I pause on this because I thought about, for this talk, and this is sort of, I'm coming to the conclusion here, and we should open this up in a few minutes, but what is really success here? And fortunately, in August 2021, in a journal called Environmental Challenges by this group of ecological economists, they actually talked about co-creation knowledge with an environmental policy development framework, and they developed a series of guidelines, impact guidelines. So in preparing for this talk, I thought, why not take apart their 5 dimensions of success, and let's see how, in retrospect, the RFS Wicked Co-Creation event actually stacked up. So here's the first criterion they came up with. Actors. Were those affected by the decision, those with power to influence the outcome, and those with information relevant to the issue or solution included, or at least represented? Well, yeah, they were. We made sure Norges Bank Investment Management was there, A4S CSL were present at the workshop. They were clearly at the concluding conference. They were part of panel sessions. They were honestly, though, only partially involved in the design of the call for proposals. We invited others to attend, but gosh, it feels like there's so much more we could have done, especially at the closing conference. So I've given ourselves a B+ on this first dimension here. Process. Were the objectives made clear and the process set up to support achieving the objectives? Was the broader context of the issue discussed and understood? Was the context of the participants taken into account? Well, I think the editorial protocol that we laid out towards publishing this first body of knowledge on climate finance, that was rock solid. We were conscious of the RFS and the SFS readers to whom we made an affirmative commitment as editors to ensure a robust editorial process, but also we're careful to involve Norges Bank, A4S, and CISL, right? So honestly, the balance was tricky, right? Because, you know, scholars need to have academic freedom to be able to pursue the questions. We want a robust protocol. So I'm generously giving an A- on this particular exercise. What about the rules? Were the researchers' roles made clear? Was there a clear intermediary? Was there a clear reward for involvement? Were the expected outcomes communicated? Well, I want to give us an A+ for this. Because we spent a lot of time designing the protocol before we actually launched in January of 17. There was a workshop, a conference, work carefully in multiple rounds with editors and referees. But honestly, I cannot give it a full A+ because there were some really interesting challenges. Maybe you'll ask me questions about it. In terms of engaging anonymous reviewers, trying to get them to get their minds around how to review a proposal instead of a completed paper, and communicating that back to the authors was a novel challenge in and of itself. Being a registered report is something that is completely foreign in our business. So I gave this not an A+, but an A. You know, maybe even that's a little generous. Resources. Was there a neutral meeting place? Were boundary limits provided? Did participants have enough time to process all information? Well, I'm going to give ourselves a B here. A little bit tough maybe, but the Columbia workshop and the London conference, I felt in retrospect, always were too fast-paced and too highly programmed to allow for the kind of free-flowing discussions that I think would have really benefited from certainly the other stakeholders like Norges Bank and industry participants that we brought. They would have benefited from kind of a little more time to digest and engage. So B is what I give here. And then finally, reflection. So were participants given enough time to reflect on the direction of the discourse, composition of the group? Was reflection taken into account? Well, the honest truth is they did get a chance to incorporate comments from the plenary discussions and the workshop and the conference. We as editors worked our tails off. We hired PhD students to help us to record the feedback and comments that were coming during these plenary events to help advance. But, you know, not enough reflection time. Certainly during the process, there was never enough time. So I'm going to give this a harsh C+, but you know, there it is. So I'm now at 12:54 out here at East Coast time, and I definitely want to give you guys some a chance. So a couple of additional thoughts. Forgive me now. I'm going to put my dean hat back on now and take my finance scholar, former editor hat off here. But I do want to mention, and I'm going to have a challenge here for you in a second. I do want to mention a couple of things. This responsible research roundtable event took place. It's a group on whose board I now serve. It's a 6-year-old initiative comprised of current and former journal editors across business and management, a bunch of deans and associate deans spanning at least 5 disciplines, ACSB, EFMD, the Aspen Institute for their Business and Society program is all part of this. That's another group that I'm now mixing with as a dean type. And it's this RRBM, the Responsible Research for Business and Management network, is devoted to inspiring and supporting what they call credible and useful research in business and management. There's definitely a tinge of the open research movement that I talked about, but it's really as much about trying to encourage scholars in business and management and finance to focus on the world's most acute problems. And they put on roundtables, conferences, workshops. Now, last year's workshop, your workshop, Basma and Michael, Christy, was actually sponsored by RRBM last year, if I'm not mistaken. That's what it says. So I'm actually really proud of the work that this group does. Now, this past June, if you can see the ad here, 28th, 29th of June, there was about 200 attendees gathering virtually for a roundtable focused on knowledge co-creation and business research for societal progress. There were tons of industry reps for non-for-profits. We had the executive director of the World Economic Forum, IBM's Academy, the UN Global Compact, the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. We brainstormed a pile of how and why these multi-stakeholder collaborations are honestly so useful in advancing knowledge, especially for the gnarliest issues that need to be tackled in this way. And mostly a lot of brainstorming about the how. And the goal now is to synthesize all this feedback from this two-day event and create a white paper, which we're working on right now. I'm on the drafting committee of that. Now, I should disclose that I helped also organize the how part of the session, the third session on how, on the second day. And honestly, it's the place where I shamelessly have ripped off the wicked adjective for today's talk. That's where I got it from. So it's not original, the word wicked for knowledge co-creation. It was there. But know that, I guess you should know that this is now a movement afoot in and across all business disciplines. And I would throw economics in there as well. I promised to mention this because I didn't know much about the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. Basma and Michael introduced me to it as they're actively involved with it. It's a consortium, as I understand, of UVic, UBC, University of Northern British Columbia, Simon Fraser, a bunch of institutes and centers, and it's focused on, here's the quote, co-design, co-developed, and co-deliver on climate solutions focused on BC, British Columbia, and beyond. And could you do me a favor? Just look at this graphic from their website. Look at that graphic and tell me if you don't think symbolically that that is a perfect knowledge co-creation graphic right there. Multiple stakeholders from NGOs, provincial, national, international levels engaged, First Nations peoples, local communities, governments from every level, business, industry, a true collaborative, right? Now, my understanding is Basma, you and Michael lead the Climate Finance Project that works with BCI, British Columbia Investment Management Corporation, the Public Pension Plan, and their risk management team. Now, by the way, in case you're wondering, no, Basma and Michael did not pay me for this plug, but I just look at this graphic and I say, that's what sings wicked knowledge co-creation right there. So let me end with a challenge here, ladies and gentlemen. If you've never heard of this concept before today, now you do, now you understand it. The benefits of academic and societal stakeholder collaboration in generating useful knowledge for the betterment of business, of multilateral organizations, of policymaking, and honestly, of society at large. And so now think about this. All of you listening in come from different parts of the world. You are at different stages of your professional career. Some of you have administrative responsibilities. Some of you come from outside the academy. And I guess I have something to share with each of you here. So if you are a dean and associate deans, and I know a bunch of you on this call, I've seen your names. I know that you are department chairs. Heads up here. More and more, it's so tempting, right, as deans, and I know this psychology here, to think about fundraising from the outside to pursue activities that advance things you create, that you can call your own. What a wicked knowledge co-creation event is a recognition of the selflessness of having to collaborate across units, not just your own, that you're building and want to take credit for as a dean or associate dean, but recognize the importance of an opportunity, not just within your respective schools, but to go beyond that, to build and fund things locally, but in a collaborative sense, working with other entities out there, especially for the big problems. If you're a center and institute director, and you've provisioned for funding, that's a wonderful place to be if you've succeeded in raising monies, and driving your own initiatives is great, but doing so in a collaborative way where you're reaching out to similar types of centers and institutes at other institutions or other organizations may be the more powerful way to go, to really push your thinking beyond, you know? What about the scholars? Well, some of you are more senior and tenured. Clearly, you want to pursue your own research objectives like you have until now. You've been successful in doing so. Maybe what I'm doing here is exhorting you to take on a little bit of a more heroic risk with the kind of research projects you take on. There's the safe plays, and then there's the bolder ones where you're hitting for the fences. And I guess with society is kind of needing you and calling on you to try and engage with these types of collaborative consortia that are bubbling up to take a bigger challenge on. If you're a more junior faculty member, and there's a bunch of you on this conference, I think this is kind of a test of your risk tolerance. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true, you know? Those of you who are more risk tolerant may actually want to take on those risks, and they can be associated with some very, very bold rewards. But it's totally understandable for you that you might actually, knowing that you've got a long career track ahead of you, to take on more safer choices. These are calculable gambles that you may need to think about. Getting successfully published, achieving successful tenure, and then maybe taking on the bolder things. So please don't think that I'm telling you to abandon your research project and, you know, go for the gusto here. We are very sober and sensible about understanding the calculated risks. And I guess tomorrow we're going to have this clean tech group meeting, right, Basma? And there are going to be a lot of industry reps there, not just. These are the funding sponsors. And for you, for those of you who are involved with industry partners or work with them or these government agencies, you know, BCI, for example, thank you for engaging with the academy. You are better off by doing so because we have incredibly smart people in the academy who are aspiring to work on the big questions that lie before you. But I guess what I need for you to hear is that you have to keep in mind the constraints of the academy. Like, for example, though it may be that this junior faculty member is the absolute ideal candidate to lean onto and provision for with some funding to support their research, and they may be eager to do so, the more senior faculty members, the deans, the associate deans may want to be protective of those younger faculty members from taking some of this on. There has to be some understanding of the constraints of the academy as you approach the academy to engage them, and you should, but definitely push your funding efforts to the places like the deans, the associate deans, the department chairs, the center and institute directors, where there is a natural opening for you, and let them work with you to understand how, in fact, to actually get these research projects off the ground. You can be an incredibly valuable forcing function for wicked knowledge co-creation events, and it could make all the difference in the world. So I'm going to stop there. I went way past, and I'm sorry, and I knew that was a risk, golly. But thank you very much for listening, and I hope I got you to think. So Basma, how do we do this?
Thank you.
I'm sure there are some reactions out there. I hope there are.
Yeah, I think people were just listening in, and and this is fascinating. Definitely, thank you very much. We can maybe give a virtual applause. The collaboration is definitely, you know, something very wicked and very challenging, and you touch upon some of the guidelines of making it successful, and, you know, who are the players and how do we do that together. Particularly, you know, shifting the risk, right, when it comes to academic. Shifting the risk. Yeah. It's a very important thing. I'd like to open it for questions. So if you want to write your questions in the chat, or just, you know, raise your hand. And if you want to raise your hand, please keep your questions really brief. We want to keep to the time. So there's, I see Paul.
Paul has his hand up there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thought I can do this. Raise my hand. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks very much for a very good talk, and in a way a feel-good talk. So I see a very strong connection between what you say and interdisciplinary research, and sort of the problem of interdisciplinary research has been almost like incentivizing interdisciplinary research, right? And now I'm putting it back to the deans and the chairs, and maybe also to the academy, more broadly speaking. How should deans, chairs, and the academy, more broadly speaking, incentivize people to do the right thing, right? Because I sympathize with your appeal to do the right thing, and you'd appeal to people like myself, but I've also sort of feel that I shot myself in the foot from time to time in my career. Now, at a place like UVic, it doesn't matter that much, I'd say. But if we turn attention to the top schools, there it's a lot harder, right? So you have to be creating systems that are incentive compatible, right? So how do we do this?
Well, money talks, Paul. It's a great question. And I know it's going through a lot of people's heads as I'm talking. Oh, fancy Andrew Dean, easy for you to say, right? But when it actually comes to doubling down and doing the gut check for an individual scholar, you know, how do you create incentives for individuals to participate in this sort of more interdisciplinary types of questions that are clearly going to have much bigger impact for society, as opposed to the clearer, cleaner questions that for which we have a well-worn path to the top journals, right? That's really what you're talking about.
Exactly, here. And I mean not just money talks, but also sort of career progress talks, right?
What's that?
I mean, especially in terms of career progress talks, right? Rather than money talks.
Well, I want to believe that high quality interdisciplinary work could find a home in any top business and management journal, discipline focused, discipline specialized business and management journal. Interdisciplinary is not a penalty. That there is a trade-off there, maybe is something we need to try to break out of our mindset, Paul. And again, you're probably saying to me, oh, easy for you to say, you know, old guy talking. But I actually do believe that you know, I sit there and I look at my distinguished colleagues who are leading the top journals, and currently and prospectively going forward. Ever increasingly, I think they are very, very much aware of the big societal issues. The pressures are there for them to be publishing journal articles that are bigger minded than always the well-worn questions that we've always seen. Paul, you know, again, can I point to something? Well, I can point to the thing I was involved with, right? I can point to that. This climate finance stuff is clearly by design interdisciplinary. We actually had it in mind, Paul, with the editors. Oh, you had to step away. We had it in mind that there would be natural pairings of scholars in finance with climate economists that had already been working on these types of questions, that already knew where the databases were that could be exploited. We had that in mind, and it did come to pass. It did come to pass. And the papers, as you can see, are being very highly cited. There's no penalty function for the interdisciplinary. I just think that people need to see a path. They need to see a path for that type of interdisciplinary research. And if it's focused on the big problems of the world, surely to goodness, that's motivating for any referee or editor. Come on, has to be.
So Andrew, we have another question from Christy from Pixan, and a really interesting question, getting into the heart of the topics, right? And from your perspective, any thoughts on research gaps at the moment, research questions that need attention, and perhaps questions that would really benefit from this collaboration and interdisciplinary or industry collaboration, right?
Well, yeah, people ask me, so, okay, thanks for this nice story, Andrew, about what you did before. What are you doing now? And the answer is, well, I'm not an editor anymore, so I'm out of that game. I'm doing something else now, but I do think about what are the big gaps. Last year, I gave a separate talk, and I actually mentioned these two words, and so I'm going to mention them again, Christy, if I can. And that is a related but separate topic, as distinct from climate change, is really the degradation of the biosphere and biodiversity all around the world. Partly related to, but not just related to, the effects of climate change. And I'm sitting here today, if I did the following search on Web of Science on the words biodiversity finance, the money that needs to be mobilized to try and mitigate the adverse degradation of the biosphere relative to the funding provisioning from multilateral organizations and governments and private sector towards the investment that is needed. I think the shortfall in one study that I saw from the Paulson Institute is somewhere on the order of like $600 to $700 billion a year over the course of the next 5 or 6 years. I guarantee you, if I looked in the top journals, top 25 journals in finance, you would find literally 0 papers on biodiversity finance. Biodiversity finance. Let it be the new words, new combination of 2 words you have heard here today. That's another big research gap. The other one that definitely comes to mind, and there's more now than just 0, is in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion in our organizations. The big issues of materiality and disclosures with respect to how we engage with our employees and our staff in our respective public and private organizations for the better and greater good and betterment of those organizations. That sounds very management and organizations-y, but it actually is a finance question too, Christy. So that's another one. I don't know what to call that. I don't have a fancy 2-word title for that topic area of a research gap, but basically finance, corporate governance, and the diversity, equity, and inclusiveness of organizations, public and private organizations, and their advancement. That is another big space there where I would love to see research, a big push on research going forward from my colleagues in the finance discipline. So there's 2. There's 2. The questions are now coming, Basma. Look at that.
Yes, I know. And you know, you mentioned you don't know a name for that. One of the guest speakers I had in my class talked about an acronym that I heard for the first time at the last year. It was JEDI, so Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion.
Okay, so it sounds like
if anyone knows
sounds
this,
like Yoda from
acronym.
Star Wars, a Jedi.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, one thing you could definitely talk about is, and this is definitely big in economics and development economics, but not so much in finance, sadly, is the whole concept of financial inclusion.
Yes.
And it's sort of a sub-discipline of household finance as people see it in finance, but it's so much bigger than that. But just financial inclusion would be another place where I'd really love to see a big push. That's a wicked problem in society, and where I'd love to see a real big push. What a great question by Christy. What a great question.
We have a few more questions. I don't know if maybe one of
take one.
Yeah, so there's one from Michael in terms of, research dissemination, basically, if you feel communicating research results through blogs or social media, as an alternative to these long publications, even the great ones in RFS that not many people would read, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's no reason that the model can't be totally ripped off and used by others. There has to be some precious reward at the end to induce scholars to behave, whether it's money or real estate in the top journals that typically draws people in. But by the way, can I just mention Mohammed Belaid has a great question here. And I know this is very, very big issue in British Columbia, my home, my original home, and certainly in Canada and all over North America, probably all over the world, is the importance of inclusiveness for Indigenous populations in financial markets. And we do have some research, but clearly not enough. That's another great suggestion by Mohammed as another big opening gap. That's terrific, terrific there. I'm just looking at Charles Donovan there. Charlie is writing a question. He's now at UW. He was at Imperial, somebody I've engaged with. He asked about curriculum development, Basma. That's a really important thing too. Wicked knowledge co-creation is research, knowledge, co-creation, but part of the knowledge creation event is knowledge dissemination. And innovative curriculum development could clearly be the subject matter of a knowledge dissemination co-creation event. It is the way in which we amplify our research to populations out there. So that's another great question by Charlie. Fantastic.
Andrew, in terms of the how, you mentioned the how is really difficult, right? And there's a question from Reem about how do you see the role of digital platforms for, enabling these collaboration in research and also dissemination?
Yeah, thank you, Reem. Actually, look at what we're doing right now. This is a completely digital event, right? I'm going to call this a knowledge co-creation event that we're involved with right now. And it's mostly researchers, right? And a traditional conference style program, but you do have this panel session. And you can imagine using the same digital platform of a virtual conference or workshop like this that engages funding agencies. They could be part of the formulation of the questions that drive the topics around which we roll up our sleeves and engage in. I would love to see more of that. Maybe PICS can be the mechanism for one of such types of events. Engage with others, reach out to others. There are clearly entities out there that crave the opportunity for a convening platform, and digitally might be the right way to do it, to be most inclusive for around the world. I don't see any reason why we couldn't do this successfully. You need to build some other infrastructure, like the things that we talked about here for a successful co-creation event, but there's no reason that we couldn't do it on a digital platform, Reem. I think it's a great question and a great suggestion. Part of the how, yeah, part of the how.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think I see some other questions, but in the interest of time, I think we need to wrap it up here. Definitely a lot of thoughts, for academics, industry, and other stakeholders to think about. We definitely need collaboration to advance our knowledge in complex issues. And thank you for your time and your advice on moving forward with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Basma. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody. And keep on the good work. Keep on doing the good work that you're doing. All the best to you. I'll be watching for the rest of the conference. Take care.
Thank you. So we have a break now, and then the next session we're going back to the regular conference Zoom link. Cheryl put it here. Thank you very much. It's the same link that we used for the first session this morning, and we do have a few really nice papers to follow in this session. Thank you very much.